Welcome to Camp Constitution Radio with your host, Hal Shurtleff. This show is heard on WBCQ The Planet every Tuesday and Thursday evenings at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's also on YouTube and Podomatic. Just go to our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to get this show probably within the next week or so. Also, Podomatic.com, and punch in Camp Constitution. You'll be able to get this in, as a podcast in a downloadable MP3 format. This show is brought to you by Camp Constitution, which, among other things, runs a week-long family camp. And this year's camp will take place in Lakeside Christian Camp and Retreat Center in beautiful Pittsfield, Massachusetts, from July 28th to August 3rd, and we have a great lineup of instructors, including Professor Willie Soon, Lord Christopher Monckton, Reverend Stevie Kraft, and Mr. John McManus, and many, many others. So for more information, please visit our website, campconstitution.net. Well, on the line is Tony Heller. Tony, how are you doing?
Good. How about yourself, Phil?
Oh, I'm doing very well, thank you. Yeah, Tony is he's the author of the Deplorable Climate Science blog, and today you had an incredible article that Willie Soon forwarded me called "The Extreme Fraud in the National Climate Assessment." Can you just give the listeners a little bit of background about yourself, and then we can talk about the article?
Yeah, Hal. Thanks for having me on. I have degrees in engineering, electrical engineering, geology.
So today you had an incredible article on your blog about the extreme fraud in the National Climate Assessment. Can you talk a little about the article? And by the way, I really appreciated all of the pictures of articles, newspaper clippings going back to the 1890s. You had one from 1936 which said something like 12,000 people died in a heat wave all across the United States.
Yeah, well, one of the big scare stories which climate alarmists use that we're all going to burn up, that it's going to keep getting hotter and hotter as carbon dioxide increases. But the fact is that in the United States, where we have the best temperature records in the world, the indication is that summers are getting cool.
In fact, I remember I was in junior high school in the early 70s and remember my pretty eighth grade science teacher telling us about the potential of an ice age. I remember a few days in the hundreds degrees, probably in the 70s, but quite frankly, while I don't have 100% recall, I don't recall a lot of days. And I live in Boston, where we did get some warm summers, but I don't recall any time in the hundreds in a long time.
Yeah, they definitely, 100-degree days were much more common in the United States 90 years ago than they are now. So that's been the big issue, and the data that was in the 2017 National Climate Assessment showed that it was much hotter in the past. There were a lot more hot days, but in the document that was released to the public in 2018, the final document, they cut all that out, and they just started their graphs in 1960. And like I said, 1960, 1970 we were very cold. Scientists at that time were actually talking about spreading soot on the Arctic in order to melt it, in order to stop a new ice age. So by starting their graphs in 1960, what they did was they've been able to show a slight increase in the number of hot days. And that's been the basis for their claim that we're all going to burn up. But they started the graphs back in 100 years ago, like say in 1918, there's been a huge decrease in the number of hot days, and it becomes obvious that we're having fewer and fewer hot days rather than more and more. So basically it was just fraud. They obviously made a calculated decision to ignore their own data, find the lowest point they could find for hot weather, and then plot a graph from that just so that they could deceive the public. It's pretty blatant. Can you imagine if Enron or some other company did something like that? People would go to jail. And it's not accidental. Their own data shows otherwise. And what's really astonishing to me is that none of the scientists who were involved in making the graphs that were in the 2017 report have spoken up about this. They've just allowed this to go through. So I see this all the time, though. They did the same thing with Arctic sea ice data. They started at the highest year. They did the same thing with fire data. We used to have a lot more burn acreage in the United States back in the 30s. Actually, about 5 times as much burn acreage in the 30s as we have now. They did the same thing. They started their graphs at a time when burn acreage was low and cut out all of the prior data. So it's a consistent pattern among government climate scientists to misrepresent their own data. They'll cherry pick a starting point, which makes their point of that it's getting hotter, that the climate's getting more severe, and just ignore any data which shows the exact opposite.
Well, that's just like the hockey stick graph. Wasn't that one of the most blatant illustrations of duplicity when they used that little graph to look like it was some serious CO2 was rising dramatically along with the temperatures? And I think, wasn't that back in 04 and 05?
I think that was originally done around 1998 or 1999 was when they started that. Yeah, and so in the 2001 IPCC report, they had that graph, the hockey stick graph in there, which directly contradicted what they had in the 1995 and 1990 IPCC reports, which showed no such thing. There's been a deliberate, and there's famous testimony for Congress. Dr. David Deming from the University of Oklahoma as a geologist testified for Congress. And he was approached by a leading climate researcher in the mid-90s who told him we need to get rid of the medieval warm period. And that's exactly what Michael Mann did with the hockey stick. Right.
Yes, I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, so there's a lot. So this has happened over and over again. There was a lot of evidence dug up in the ClimateGate emails. They were openly communicating that they wanted to get rid of the 1940s blip, which was this period of warmth in the 30s and 40s, and they did that. They removed it. They wanted to get rid of the medieval warm period, and they did that. And they wanted to get rid of the hot 1930s in the United States, and that's what they did in this year's National Climate Assessment. So it's a very consistent pattern of fraud and deception.
Of course, the ultimate goal, it looks like it's a big power grab. Now, I'm very familiar with Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, and the transformation of society through this idea of lower your carbon footprint, sea level rising. Yeah. And can you comment on this Green New Deal that has been proposed in the Congress just recently?
Well, yeah. Obviously, this was the result. I mean, it was proposed by someone who was very young, who grew up in our school system where they're fed nonstop propaganda about global warming, and they watched Al Gore's sci-fi flick, and they've been taught that we're facing this huge catastrophe unless we get rid of our fossil fuels. And it was obviously a pretty logical thing for her to promote because this is what she's been taught and probably what she believes. But it's complete nonsense. This idea that 12 years from now there's going to be this huge climate catastrophe. There's no evidence that the climate is getting more severe. You can go through just any one of the things they claim are getting more severe, and if you actually look at the historical data, you can see that that's not true. We're not headed towards any sort of climate apocalypse. I'm sure there's a lot of other environmental problems we've got facing us, but carbon dioxide and the climate is not one of them. And furthermore, so their solution is to eliminate fossil fuels, right? The fossil fuels are this evil thing, and nobody else can do that, right? China's not going to do that. China emits more than twice as much carbon dioxide as the United States does. And between China and India, they're building more than 1,000 new coal-fired power plants. So nothing the United States does will make any difference anyway. But the plan is for the United States to unilaterally disarm, get rid of our fossil fuels. And what would people, just in the past 2 weeks, Illinois set their all-time record for cold of minus 38 degrees. Hawaii just set their all-time record for cold. They just had their lowest elevation snowfall on record in Hawaii. It was snowing on Maui last week,
wow,
which is unheard of.
Yeah, they live in New England, and in Greater Boston, which not as much snow as we've had, and I think that's what happens when you have a couple of relatively mild days in the middle of winter. Instead of enjoying it, we have to be afraid. Oh my goodness, this is a horrible trend. The crocuses aren't coming out yet, but if they bloom a little early, we should say, isn't this a nice sign instead of worrying about it?
Yeah. I don't remember the exact date, but I was just looking at an article the other day. I think I posted on my blog. It was from sometime about 80 or 90 years ago. It was 80 degrees in Boston in January, and I commented, imagine the hysteria if that happened now.
Well, I remember when I was in the Army Reserves, we had cold weather training in February, probably 80, maybe 1983. It was a weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And the first night it was in the 30s, maybe upper 20s. The next day it was in the low 60s, and Sunday was low 70s. And I felt a little guilty because this was what I was used to when I was stationed in Germany. This was nice weather. But then it got cold again, and I remember mid-March being in the low 90s for 1 or 2 days, and then going back to the typical March, cold weather.
In order to understand, the past temperatures, you actually have to look at it. People rely on this sort of anecdotal ideas. They think it used to be colder, or it used to be warmer, or we didn't used to get weather like this. But if you actually go and look through the historical data like I've done, you find that none of this is true. There were plenty of times when there were warm winters, plenty of times when there were cold winters. The storyline of White Christmas is that it was Christmas Eve, they're in Vermont, and there's no snow. Right? And that was 1954, and they were dreaming of a white Christmas. And in 1954, it was an extremely warm winter. It was true. And if you look at the 1932 Lake Placid Olympics, there wasn't any snow at all. A couple of weeks before the Olympics, they didn't think they were going to be able to hold an Olympics at all at Lake Placid in 1932. And then they got a little bit of snow. And then in the middle of it was like February 11th, 1932. They had a very warm day, and just about all the snow melted off the bobsled run. So this stuff has gone on forever. Cold winters, hot winters, but people tend to rely on anecdotal evidence rather than looking at actual data.
Well, having historical background, 1620 when the Pilgrims landed, it was a mild winter. They still half of them still died. And April 19th, 1775, it was a warm, unseasonably warm day when the British marched into Lexington and conquered, and then got their butts kicked all the way back to Boston. And I take in the reenactment with my family and videotape it for the last 15 years. And for the most part, it's pretty cold. I mean, it's usually, in the 20s, low 30s. One day, I think it was in the 50s with some drizzle, which was almost pleasant. But it's usually cold. And, that was, 200 years ago, more than 200 years ago, it was warmer than it is today. Are you familiar with Noah Webster's 1810 book?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting because we put it back in print, and I think he started that in the 1790s, and then he published it on the supposed change of temperature in winter. And what made me think of that is that in the article you had some critter. I forget what it was, an aardvark. It's not an aardvark, some kind of critter, possum maybe. That this was back in I don't know, so many years ago. Was it an armadillo that they were found further north, and now they're heading back south again because the climate is getting colder. That was what led people back in the early 1800s to think that the winters are getting warmer. They thought it was a good thing. They didn't panic about it, including Thomas Jefferson, because certain species of animals were being found further north. And, it's interesting in Connecticut, in West Haven or East Haven, Connecticut, there are parrots that are out that survive in the, in the city out, I won't say wilderness, but wild. They're thriving there, and no one's suggesting that area's become tropical because some parrots are able to survive winters there in Connecticut.
Right. Well, there was a famous debate between Thomas Jefferson and Noah Webster about global warming. Thomas Jefferson was a big believer that the temperature was warming up. And Webster took the position that what Jefferson had observed was that just they cleared a lot of forest land out, and the snow was melting sooner because there was more sunshine reaching the ground. And it was generally agreed that Webster won the debate, and Jefferson agreed with him that what they were observing was actually more like urban heat island effects. Also interesting was in George Washington's first January in office, right when he was inaugurated. The Capitol was in Philadelphia. That was 1790. And that was the warmest January on record in Philadelphia. They had many days over 70 degrees. There were a lot of reports of boys swimming in the rivers.
Wow.
I spent last spring in Philadelphia, which was the coldest spring on record, and it was miserable. It was March. Yeah, March was snowing every day. It was horrible.
It's fascinating. Like you say, anecdotal. My local city councilors would say something like, "Oh, don't you remember when you were kids there was more snow?" Yeah, that's because you were only 3 or 4 feet tall, and 2 feet would be half of what you were. I did mention that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Yeah, the 60s and 70s, did have a lot of snow. And actually, Robert Kennedy Jr. He grew up in just west of Washington D.C. in the 60s, and there was a ton of snow then, and he got this idea in his head that was normal for Virginia. But actually, if you look at the years before that and the years after that, it wasn't. So he came to the conclusion that it was, at one point he actually wrote an article saying it was Sarah Palin's fault that they weren't getting as much snow in Virginia.
Uh-huh. Well, I live near the Blue Hills Weather Observation Tower, which is, I think, the longest running from the 1880s. And you could go there, you know, it's open to the public on certain hours, and you could see what the temperature was for the last 100 years or so on, you know, you look in your birthday and say, oh, 1959, that's when. And it's fascinating because you don't, if you just simply look at the hard evidence, and it's a pretty accurate readings. You did mention that we have the best readings in the world as far as land-based temperature readings, even though a lot of these have been compromised. Anthony Watts, of course, did a lot of great research on that topic.
Yeah, well, the United States has by far the best temperature record in the world. You know, Europe, it's been disrupted by a lot of wars. They don't have very complete records there in a lot of places. Germany is a notable exception. They do have good records there. Japan has good records and a few places in Australia. But outside of that, you know, the United States is the only large area in the world which has a really good, coherent long-term temperature record, which is what makes the whole idea of a global average temperature just a farce. There's so little data for much of the world. You know, when NASA and NOAA published these graphs showing, you know, this long-term historical data, they're just making stuff up. It's not based on any real science, what they're doing.
Yeah, what in your opinion, what is the motivation behind this?
Well, I think that, you know, there's different people have different motivations. I think that at one time there were people who thought they were going to make a ton of money off these carbon exchanges, and so there was a lot of rich people. Al Gore was certainly involved in that. A lot of other billionaires were involved in it. They saw this as a way to just scam huge amounts of money off these carbon markets. You know, and that kind of fell apart. You know, the other people latched onto it, politicians. I think people who were people on the left who are inclined to like big government see this as a great way for government to seize control. Certainly the United Nations has been pushing this whole idea of, you know, one world government was the only way we're going to stop this global warming thing. So they've got, as far as the scientists themselves go, there's this incredible pressure on them to deliver the results which the government wants. If every climate scientist who's funded understands the rules. If you go along with the global warming thing, you'll get your grants, you'll get your nice trips to Bali and Cancun, places like that. You'll get prestige, you'll get interviewed by the press. But if you go up against it, you get your funding cut off, you'll get ostracized, you'll get attacked. Even Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island has actually threatened prosecution against climate skeptics. My good friend Dr. Bill Gray, who passed away a couple years ago from Colorado State University, he was the leading tropical meteorologist in the world, and the guy who invented hurricane forecasting. When Al Gore became vice president in 1993, he invited Dr. Gray to come to a global warming meeting. Yeah, and Bill said, well, I'd be happy to come, but you need to know that I'm not a big fan of your theories. Well, Bill had gotten funding from NOAA every year since the 60s. He got his funding cut off, never got another penny out of the government because he went up against, you know, the climate industrial complex is what I call it. And every scientist understands this, who's involved in this. They know they go along, they'll get their funding, everything will go good. If they toe the line, if they go up against it, bad things are going to happen to them. They all understand this. So that's how they create the consensus. It's sort of a carrot and stick approach. You get your funding, you get your prestige, you go up against us, we're going to beat you up bad.
I think it's not just a scientist. I think it's anyone. I mean, I see a lot of, you look at websites of big companies and organizations, sustainable this, sustainable that, carbon footprint, and you look at contractors, benefit corporations, it's almost like being kosher certified. You better be green or you won't get the contract from that government entity to build the new apartment complex or the highways or what have you.
Yeah, well, and it's terrible. I'm a very high-profile target myself, and so there's lots of websites out there which I don't know who's funding it. I assume it's Tom Starr, but I'm not positive. Just attacking me, right? Making all sorts of lies about me. They have people pretending to be me, just putting hideous things on there. And it causes me all kinds of personal harm. Like I've been fired from jobs. I had a contract lined up a couple of weeks ago. They were about to sign me in it, and they found out about this, that I'm this horrible climate skeptic person, and they backed out of it. And I run into this all the time. So and I'm outside of academia. I'm an engineer. For people who are inside academia, the pressure is much more intense. You go up against this climate industrial complex, you're going to get pounded on if you're inside academia.
Well, I call it the green mafia.
Yeah, that's what it is. They use mafia tactics for keeping people in line.
Well, I have to say, when they go after you, I looked at that website you're referring to, with filthy language and vile, and I say you must be doing something right for these folks that go after you as much as they have.
Yeah, well, when you're over the target, if you're catching flack, you're over the target, right?
Well, there's an old saying, there's an old Southern saying, when you throw a rock at a pack of hogs, the one that squeals is the one that you hit, And I have to say that the Smog, that's that Canadian left-wing blog, they attacked Camp Constitution, and they said that we have notorious climate deniers teaching young people. I said, how do you become a notorious as opposed to a notorious climate denier versus a climate denier? I mean, that's like a 5-star general, I guess, in the denial, so-called climate denial ranks. So I think that's a badge of honor, and especially that young people are learning about this the right way, not through their government schools, learning the scare tactics.
Right.
Well, we only have a couple of minutes left. How can people get a hold of you or get a hold of your writings? Where can they find you on the web?
Well, my blog is realclimatescience.com. And you can look for me on YouTube. My YouTube channel is, I think it's Tony Heller 1. But if you just search for my name, Climate, on YouTube, you'll find it. And my Twitter handle is Steve S. Goddard, which is a long story.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being a guest, especially on such short notice. Folks, thank you for listening to Camp Constitution Radio, heard on WBCQ The Planet every Tuesday and Thursday evening. And until next week, may God bless you. Good night.